Chapter 14 The Return. Henceforth I ask not good fortune. I myself am good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing. After a long illness, one's recovery comes like the spring in our northern valleys. It was in late April I came home again. Days there were, the fordawn of the year, days of such magical sweetness and warmth that it seemed of a certainty spring had come. New soft foliage on the poplars, the golden mists of the elm trees, hyacinths under the sumacs. One's mind runs away towards recovery far faster than his body. Then come days of sad withdrawal, days of cloudy hesitation, when the budding year retires within a grey cowl of penitence. We have cold rains slanting down, flurries of reminiscent snow, piercing winds out of the northwest, and all the world again turns chill and drab. One does not, fortunately, know it at the time, but there are two periods of convalescence. I think I have not spoken too ardently of the first, with its joyous sense of renewed security. I found the second, after my return, more difficult to bear, in certain ways, than the early days of my illness when pain and discomfort were expected and studied occupations. I, too, had my cold rains slanting down. I had my cowl of penitence. Heavy weeks of slow recovery there were, when every instinct of my nature cried out for rest. Stop! Wait! Any road I walked grew intolerably long. Any hill I climbed, too high. All the work I did, too hard. Such an appetite for recovery, so little food to satisfy it. In the hospital, during my convalescence, I had no need of any outward action or responsibility. I could devote my entire attention to delightful excursions in the quiet and happy country of the mind. I had now to take myself over, a growing concern, and try to catch up with a swift-moving and clamorous world. Those who have themselves been ill will know well the feeling of that time and the discouragements of it. What a blessing, those days, I found in my garden and orchard, and especially among my bees. I shall not easily forget the spacious quietude of those May mornings, with the sun looking in over the hills of Pelham, and the dew still on the grass, the meadows green again, and the apple trees beginning to bloom. I know of nothing that will more completely absorb the mind than the slow, careful, minute tasks of the bee master. Other familiar labour of the garden or farm or orchard, for want of variety, sometimes loses its charm, but one may find an inexhaustible delight in the strange ways of the bee people. After many years' experience, I am as much interested as ever I was. I am still a besotted amateur. In the hard days of my convalescence, I found nothing that fitted so exactly the limitations of my physical strength and at the same time satisfied the appetite aroused during my illness for that which was slow and deep and still. One cannot force nature. A beekeeper who hurries soon repents. How pleasant it was, then, sitting there in the scented orchard with my back to the sun, slowly going through the hives, slowly, never making a false motion, lifting the bee-covered frames, examining the state of the brood and stores, watching for Her Majesty the Queen, learning at a glance whether the colony has begun rearing drones, and finding and cutting out the new queen cells. A fascinating process, never more easily practiced than at this season of the year when the bees are busy and comfortable with new stores of nectar and pollen coming in. One needs scarcely wear a bee veil or gloves if he knows how to go about the delicate business with that courtesy and gentleness due to the manners and customs of an ancient society. When I began beekeeping, now long ago, I was often stung, but in the last half-dozen years I have had scarcely a half-dozen stings, and these were usually due to my own haste or stupidity. I think sometimes that almost all the mistakes I have made in my life have been the result of haste. When I grew weary, and this at first was often enough, I stopped where I sat and watched the urgent, unself-conscious, strangely beguiling life of the world of the bee people, with its unfathomable social laws and its intricate customs. I watched the workers darting out of the hive with a kind of fierce energy, lifting in the sunny air, circling once or more about, and then with swift certainty heading for the blossom fields where their harvest was making. I watched them coming in again, heavily laden with pollen and nectar, often so weary with their load that they could not quite make the landing board, waddling into the hive like tipsy sailors with their dunnage bags full of yellow or brown or red pollen. I watched the young bees coming out when the sun grew warm and the air dry to play in front of the hive, using their new wings with inimitable grace, preparing themselves for the stern labour soon to come. It is a beautiful process and grows upon one as he becomes intimately familiar with the significance of all the sights, sounds, odours of the hive and the varied habits of its long-settled social life. A hard and fast communism, if ever there was one, with the life of the individual wholly devoted to the welfare of the swarm. To look down into it, one feels like some god watching for his own delight the flowing life of a world as distant from his own, as self-contained, as it is unconscious of his existence. He may destroy it. Destruction is easy for a god. Or he may, by acting upon laws wholly beyond the range of the bee world, work strange miracles with it, like putting into a colony frames of brood or honey the bees have not themselves made, or cutting out the queen cells, or clipping the wings of the queen herself so that the colony cannot swarm. He may, in some degree, direct the activities of the bees so that they serve his purposes as well as their own, purposes of which they know nothing, but he cannot, for all his power and his knowledge, change in the slightest particular the ages-old law of the hive. He himself, however omniscient, can work with the colony only as he himself also learns and obeys the laws of it. I have sometimes speculated upon what might be the thinking of a philosopher of the swarm, if such could possibly be imagined. He would be no worker. Workers are too busy making and banking their honey, nor yet a queen, since the queen is absorbed in the domestic affairs of the hive. Probably an old, idling drone, with little to do in the world but loaf and invite his soul. He would be the philosopher. He could perhaps predicate from the evidences of what he might call providence or fate or miracle or law, the existence of a power beyond the hive. He might speculate as to its paradoxes, consider its will, but what, after all, could he know of me? Often, if I tired of working with or watching the bees, I would recall, as I sat there in the sun, some of the things that had come to my mind while I was in the hospital, especially if they seemed applicable to the moment. One passage occurred to me that I did not even know I had kept in my memory. It was from Dr. Johnson, and I have since looked it up to see that I quoted it correctly. "No man," said he, "is obliged to do as much as he can do. A man is to have part of his life to himself." I liked especially the last half of this quotation and said it over a number of times as I sat there idling by the hives. A man is to have part of his life to himself. Another passage I repeated upon occasions when I began to feel in my weakness that the world was too much for me. "A man of understanding hath lost nothing, if he yet have himself." But I loved most of all, in those days, to lose myself completely in unhurried enjoyment, the concentration of the entire mind upon the simple tasks in hand. I liked even the somewhat monotonous work of preparing new hives, stringing the brood frames with wire, and setting in the foundation comb. I liked to fit together the comb honey sections. How good the odour of the clean, new whitewood, and wax in the starters. There is salvation alike to worn bodies and tired souls in these quiet and simple processes of the hands. The knotted strands of life are thus by slow magic untangled, and one comes to be like a child, absorbed in play, with the world grown newly happy. And it is no mere anodyne of escape, for there is in it the ancient logic of labour, wherein the result is honey in the honeycomb. All of these experiences and meditations helped greatly during the days of what I have called my second convalescence, before I dared test my strength with any real labour. Idle days they were, lazy, still, rich days, full of a kind of delight I had never quite felt before. For I found myself willing to be slow and quiet, to look long at one thing. In the old life, I was scarcely ever able to wait until the full meaning or beauty of anything, whether the aspects of nature or the written word, came in upon me. I was too swift. What I planted yesterday in the fertile soil of my spirit, I wanted to pull up today to see if the roots had sprouted. I was not willing to be quiet and await the sure processes of the sun and the rain. All Americans are something like that. In our bemused faith in speed, we think some instrument can be had that will obliterate time and shorten growth. But the law of the spirit is not unlike that of the body. The period of silent gestation that must follow the conception of thought is immutable. Those too are triflers, said the philosopher, who have wearied themselves in life by their activity. As I grew stronger, I began to have, day by day, a keener sense of life, the intensity of life. Even the small and disagreeable chores of the orchard and the land became immeasurably precious to me. I even had days when I felt that I could write again. I was humbly thankful that I could do anything at all. One morning in particular I remember vividly, so vividly that I wrote down an account of the incident in my notebook under the date of May 14th. I was standing at the top of a ladder, flinging out clouds of vile-smelling sulphur and arsenate of lead. We were spraying the apple trees. Down below, Frank, my helper, was pumping the ancient contraption which we had tinkered into another year's service. "Pump, Frank! Pump for your life!" And Frank pumped, and I sent a mist of poison into the topmost branches. We had studied the light morning airs and moved slowly around each tree until every calyx had had its minute attention. "A good job," said Frank. "I guess that'll give 'em a stomach ache." It may seem ridiculous, for this is quite the most disagreeable task of the garden, but it suddenly came over me, as I stood perched high on the ladder, in the full glory of the morning, that there was something incalculably and indescribably beautiful about it all. I was newly and intensely aware of the robins singing, and the bees humming in the nearby hives, and the sun looking down the hill with the promise of a fair and perfect morning. I caught myself saying under my breath, "Thank God, thank God." It seemed as though, doubter as I am, that God was somewhere not distant and easily to be thanked. I felt like pinning this date in May, as Pascal pinned the date of his conversion, to an inner garment over my heart. As I came up the hill a little later, I saw pale yellow tulips, blooming among the low-growing phlox, and the wisteria on the porch, grown eager in the summery days of May, hanging full of half-opened blossoms, delicate, lacy, more like a mist of beauty than a realised blooming. I saw all these things as I never had seen or felt them before. "Thank God," I said, "I am well again. I can work again."